this discussion could not be more timely because, as you know, we live in very uncertain times, especially uncertain financial times, uncertain economic times. And frankly, we live in an era when even the experts are lost. And all of us, frankly, are groping for answers to the state of the world. And of course, this brings me to my second point, which is the best person in the whole world, and I'm not exaggerating, Paul, who can actually guide us through these uncertain times is Mr. Paul Volcker. For that, please join me in thanking Paul Volcker for this. It may be useful for us to begin this conversation with a kind of, if you don't mind, your own sort of broad-based assessment of where we are today in the world, the global economy. Are we going up, down, sideways? What's happening to the global economy?
Well, it's not a very happy story. I could say a four-letter word, like it's in a mess. I don't know if it's quite that bad, but we are, economically, we are tilted up, but it's a very slight tilt compared to usual recoveries. We've had a big recession, but not a typical recession. It is complicated to understate it by a massive breakdown in the financial system, at least in the developed world, and certainly in New York and in London and in Europe. And the combination of a recession with a financial breakdown is bad news. But in a way, it's worse than that. This recession and financial breakdown reflects the culmination of some continuing imbalances in the world economy. And when we say the world economy, we certainly mean the United States, still an important actor, but increasingly means also Asia, China in particular, but Asia generally. It's an old story. The United States consuming too much, borrowing too much, having easy money, partly as a result of the ability or willingness of China and other Asian countries, Japan to some extent, the Middle East, lend money to the United States very freely at low interest rates, help support our excessive consumption. But we've had a buildup of trillions of dollars in the hands of foreign governments. And that's not a stable situation. It couldn't go on forever, and we now have kind of been caught up short by the financial crisis, but underlying the financial crisis was excessive consumption in the United States, arguably excessive investment or excessive underconsumption in China. 15 years ago, we would not have thought of China as being big enough. It's always big population, big country, but not big enough on the economic scene to be part of a big international imbalance. But now we have a world that's topsy-turvy in a way. Asia continues to grow almost right through the crisis. The whole developed world not growing very well. But we're in, I think, a slow recovery. Slow because we had a big financial crisis. Slow because we've had too much indebtedness, which we have to work our way through. And slow because we had these big underlying problems of too much consumption in the United States, too little consumption in parts of Asia.
What would your advice be to the administration now? What would you advise them to do, given the present situation?
My advice to the country would be have patience. There's nothing that's going to cure this economy in the short run. We are going to have, hopefully, some continuing growth, but are we going to have enough growth to put the unemployment rate down in a hurry, which is what people would like to see? Are we going to create a lot of jobs in the short run? Well, I hope we create some. But the chances of having a recovery of the kind we had in the mid-1980s, we had a severe recession. Within 6 months or so, after the recession was over, the economy was growing 5% a quarter at an annual rate. 5%, 6%, 7%, 8% for a couple of years. I think the chance, and the unemployment rate going down, employment going up, I think the chances of that happening now are limited, to say the least, very limited.
One of the things that's happening in Washington, D.C., as you know, and you see this in the president elections that are going to take place today, is a kind of an effort to try and blame China for many of these problems. Many Americans say that all these problems will be solved if China could appreciate renminbi. What do you think of that?
Well, I think there's some danger, all this gets politicized, and if it makes a kind of fight between America and China, that's unfortunate. China is a big economy now. Second biggest economy in the world, so you can't say they're not there. In fact, we were discussing a little earlier this afternoon from the Chinese standpoint, I think. They don't want to get uncompetitive with respect to the rest of Asia. Mm-hmm. They're closely linked with Asia. They import a lot from Asia. I believe they're in deficit with Asia. Mm-hmm. And so they don't want to get out, as I understand it. I maybe don't understand it. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese don't want to get out and take big measures with exchange rates or otherwise that makes them uncompetitive in Asia. And there is a challenge, I think, for rebalancing the rest of the world with Asia.
It's becoming very clear that to solve many of these problems, no country can do it by itself. That you require more and more coordination within different countries. And the problem is that most of the governments are driven by domestic agendas, but they have to sort of coordinate, they have to take care of the global agenda too. So how do you see that problem being solved? Will the G20 do it?
I mean, just to illustrate the problem, in this whole century, the early part of the century, the United States kept spending beyond its means. Asia kept producing more than it could absorb and it exported. And you could see that was a train wreck ready to happen because the United States was borrowing too much. The other countries were too dependent upon selling to the United States. But it was very convenient, so who wanted to change it? And it was so easy to borrow money in the United States, we had a big bubble in the housing market. We had very weak credit standards. And when that began, when that particular bubble burst, the whole facade fell apart, including the underlying imbalance that made it so easy for us to borrow and so easy for Asia to sell.
What would you have done differently?
We got to have a little more discipline here.
Do you believe that the Financial Reform Act, which has just been passed, will it significantly change the behavior of the Wall Street banks, or will it not?
Well, first of all, the crisis itself should have changed behavior of Wall Street banks. Maybe not enough.
Yeah.
But obviously that raised enough questions. So whether you had some reform or not, we're not going to run into subprime mortgages in a hurry because the whole facade upon which that was based is shattered, namely the inevitable rise in housing prices. But we have enacted some legislation. But if you ask me whether all the attitudes on Wall Street have changed, I think, unfortunately, the answer is no, not yet. Why should we change? They get used to making millions and millions of dollars. And, from the standpoint of somebody making millions of dollars, why don't we keep it going? That's pretty good stuff.
The creators of value in an economy are supposed to be agriculture and industry, and the financial sector is supposed to support the main economy. But now you have a situation where the financial sector takes up 40% of corporate profits. So how do you change that balance again?
Finance at one point got to 40% of 1 year by one measure, or whatever it was. It got into the high 30s, 30% or more, much higher than it had ever been. That doesn't count profits come after all the pay that was made, all the millions of dollars that were made by the so-called workers on Wall Street. All the smartest people and graduating from college, including my grandson, go into finance. And what's the result? The economy was growing no faster in these years than it grew earlier. Finance became enormously complicated. It got taken over with the great attraction of so-called financial engineering. If you were good at mathematics, if you showed promise as a physicist, if you were a good engineer, you didn't want to do physics, you didn't want to do engineering, you wanted to go in finance and make a lot of money. and you adopted very sophisticated mathematical techniques that were alleged to distribute risk, to eliminate risk. Well, there's no indication it helped the economy. There's no indication that it really diffused risk. Finance, it was too richly rewarded. And that's a big adjustment that has to be made. We can't go back to that system. That's part of what the whole effort of reform is designed to ameliorate. Now, is there resistance? Yes. And the people making all that money aren't going to walk away.
They're busy writing the rules now to implement the Volcker rule.
Yes.
And are you confident that when they write the rules that they will achieve what you set out to
Well,
achieve?
I will do my best to try to
You're going to push very hard.
encourage that answer, yes. But when it comes to the basic question, should so-called proprietary trading be permitted in banks? The legislation is pretty clear. The starting point is no. How you apply that restriction is up to the regulators, but the rule is pretty clear, no.
Tom Rowe from the European Union. I'm attached to the Lee Kuan Yew School for a year now. I'd like to also point out that most of the discussion, and that's your expertise now today, is about the financial sector, financial adjustment. But what about the real economy? What are Americans and Europeans and probably Japanese, what are we looking at in terms of real adjustments? You're talking about financial reform, but there are going to be some real adjustments to this.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We have to make real adjustments. That's my whole song, and if it didn't come through, I want to sing it again. We're going to have to consume relatively less. We're going to have to invest relatively more. We got a lot of infrastructure to work on in the United States, too. We're going to invest more, and we've got to export more. And to export more, we've got to produce more. And that means more manufacturing. We've got our manufacturing's never going to be where it used to be in the United States and many other countries. But it's got to be a little more than it has been, so that we have more to export and less to consume ourselves. Or we need more manufacturing to satisfy some of our consumption at home. So that's absolutely basic. The financial stuff is all froth, and it's got us screwed up in a way. But basically, we have an economic adjustment to make. But I think, in fairness, some Asian countries have an economic adjustment to make, too.
What does Singapore have to learn from the United States currently, and vice versa? What does the United States have to learn from Singapore moving forward, not necessarily historically, but moving forward, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, actually, I think there's quite a lot we can learn from Singapore. One of my concerns about the United States and other countries is having an efficient, effective civil service. And I am led to believe that Singapore does a pretty good job.
Number one.
And they've got this, per capita, they got one of the strongest schools of public policy and public administration.
That's right.
But it's known as a place that's in an area of the world that has lots of corruption, a place that is clean and has very little corruption and efficient. And I think there's a pride in the civil service here and in government that we've lost in the United States pretty fundamentally.
The whole point of such a discussion here is to see whether or not we can get a better understanding of the scale and intensity of the problems that we're dealing with. And for this, please join me in thanking Paul Volcker.